Tell me a scary story. I'll go first. For starters, I live in the Appalachian Mountains, so our dogs used to run off all the time. One day, me and my younger cousin got off of the bus and we noticed that the dogs were nowhere to be found. We lived surrounded completely by forest. Them not being there wasn't unusual, so we decided just to go off and look for them in the woods, which is something we did pretty often, so we weren't scared. Me and my cousin started walking through the woods, calling for the dogs, and I had the stupid idea to start whistling. We heard what sounded like our dog barking coming from deeper in the woods, so we started walking towards the sound. But the deeper we were walking in the woods towards the sound, started getting this really bad feeling in my gut that we needed to turn around. I told my cousin how I was feeling, and he told me that he was sure that was our dogs barking. We decided to keep walking, and then we heard a whistle coming from the direction that the dog's barking was coming from. When I was whistling, I wasn't doing like a normal whistle, I was doing this weird whistle, and this sounded just like the weird whistle I had just done. Almost like whatever it was copying me. We stopped walking and we heard more barking, and I just knew that it wasn't our dogs barking. Like, it did sound similar, but it just wasn't the same. That's when my little cousin looked at me scared like he was about to say something, and I told him just ignore it. I grabbed his hand and we started to calmly walk back home. I didn't say anything, but the entire time we were walking, it sounded like something was walking back behind us. We kept making the walk back home. It took us another 15 minutes to make it. When we finally did make it back home, we were trying to convince ourselves that it had actually just been our dogs. About 5 minutes later, our older cousin showed up and we told her what had happened, and she said that we still needed to go find the dogs. So she grabbed her dog who can track their scents, and we headed back into the woods. We started calling their names like we had done before, and I started to whistle. My older cousin stopped me and pointed at her dog, who was sitting on the ground growling, looking up at the top of the trees. I grabbed my younger cousin and said we should leave. My older cousin told us no, the dogs could be hurt, so we needed to keep looking for them. After a little convincing, we started walking deeper, but not in the direction that the dog was growling at, just in the opposite direction. We were walking maybe for 5 or 6 more minutes when we heard what sounded like my mom calling for us, saying she had found the dogs. My mom was in Texas at the time, and she wouldn't be home for 2 more days. We decided to leave. We went the long way, so we weren't walking towards where the voice came from. When we got home, my younger cousin was crying, asking what if the dogs were hurt, because we just still hadn't found the dogs. Right about that time, our neighbor came walking up the driveway with our dogs. He said they'd been in his house the entire time. He had found them and brought them into his house because the game warden was there. He didn't want them to be taken, so he waited until the game warden left, and then he brought them home to us. The next day, my uncle was asking us about it. When we told him what happened, he looked so scared and said that the game warden was there because one of the neighbors had called in and reported seeing a weird, demented, sick-looking, huge black dog in the forest by our house. They also reported hearing the creepy whistling and barks. The story was actually DM'd to me by a follower. In honor of spooky season, I'm going to be reading a lot more of the stories that y'all send to me on here, so be sure to send them to my DM. I got another story for you. This story was sent to me by a follower who had a creepy encounter in the woods of West Virginia. Which, if you didn't know, West Virginia is the only state completely covered with the Appalachian Mountains. Alright, let's get to the story. I grew up in rural West Virginia, and my grandparents owned my grandfather's old family farm. It was roughly about 120 acres of land inside of a valley. Only thing on this property was my great-great-grandparents' house. My grandpa would always tell me and my cousin all about all the Appalachian legends and stories that he had heard growing up. Now, while I loved hearing all the stories, my cousin was not a fan. Grandpa would always take us down there with him, and he would go hunting, or he was just there to make sure nobody was trespassing, because trespassing was a problem in the area. He was very laid back, but he only had 2 rules that we absolutely had to follow while we were there. Stay in eyesight of him, and never go past the grove of apple trees. He always told us if we went over there, we would be trespassing on somebody else's property. Until one day I found out that was 100% not the reason that he wanted me to stay away from those apple trees. This day, me and my cousin decided to take our 4-wheelers and go riding on these trails that we had made. As we're riding through the trails, I catch a glimpse of something walking in the apple trees. It was walking straight towards my great-great-grandparents' house about 150 yards away. I immediately stopped, which made my cousin slam into the back of my 4-wheeler. He started yelling at me to watch out, but I told him to shut up and look at the old house. This house had always scared me and him anyways, just because of the looks of it. It was run down, and when you're a kid, that stuff's just creepy. We used to say that's where the boogeyman lived, and we'd always just stay away. I told my cousin it looked like our grandpa had just walked inside because our grandpa was a rather big guy. He was like 6'5", 350 pounds. I decided to turn off the four-wheeler, and for some reason I took off walking towards the apple trees. My cousin followed behind me because he didn't want to be left alone in the woods. As we're walking up the hill towards the apple trees, we hear a loud smack coming from inside the house. We both dropped down because we figured it was our grandpa bringing something out, and if he saw us, he'd paint our back porch red for us being out that far. As we lay there completely quiet, a large arm and hand comes out and grabs the frame of the house. We could hear the walking coming closer to the apple trees, so we just kept hiding. Once the footsteps stopped, we could hear like the rustling of tree branches and apples falling, hitting the ground. We both looked up and saw something that we at first thought was a bear. It was roughly 7.5 feet tall and covered in brown hair. Like I said, my first thought was a bear because we do have bears in that country. It was standing completely on two legs, just like a human, and it was using one hand to shake the tree branches and holding a bunch of apples in the other hand, at least 5 or 6 apples, but it could have held more. I was frozen in fear until all of a sudden my cousin took off running towards the four-wheeler. When he took off, the creature dropped the tree branch and just turned and was staring right in our direction. I took off running too, and I was right on my cousin's tail as we made it to the four-wheelers. We jumped on them and ripped out of there as quick as we could. Once we made it back to where Grandpa was, his face was beet red. It's like he knew something had happened. He told us to get in the truck now. So we did, and we took the longest ride home. He never once said a word about it back then. I'm almost 30 now, and about 8 months ago, he brought it up. Told him what I saw, and he told me that he told us to stay away from that area. He said that just because our family's name was on the title, that it didn't belong to our family. That part belonged to him. I've gone back many times since then, but I'll still never cross over and go to the apple groves again. Let me know y'all's thoughts on this story in the comments. Send any of your creepy and scary stories to my DM. I'm gonna keep going through them and picking ones to read. Y'all gotta hear this creepy story that happened here in the Appalachian Mountains in eastern Kentucky. This story was sent to me by one of my followers. As children, we were always told to come home when the porch lights come on. If you hear or see something, no you did not. And never answer to your name being called when you know you're alone, even if the voice sounds familiar. I was scared of the dark and never much of a rule breaker when it came to the woods, especially at night, and I knew my rules about the woods. But as an adult, I got a little more curious, and I love to take hikes and walks, especially in the Moorhead area. My mom and grandparents who were from the area would always warn me when I went to Lockagee that I needed to be safe and stay vigilant. Lockagee is a popular rock formation near Cave Run Lake, and it's known for apparent cult activity. One day, me and my friend and my second-born, who was 2 at the time, were wasting time in Moorhead. My friend had never been to Lockagee, so I told him, let's take a ride up and I'll show you where it's at. As we were driving by Lockagee, I started to tell him about the rumored cult activity that happened there. It led me into talking about another location in the area that was rumored to have cult activity. This place is called Clack Mountain. He said, well, while we're out, why don't we just drive there too? Couldn't remember exactly how to get there because when I went, I wasn't the driver, so I put it into GPS. It showed that we were really close to it, but in my mind, I was thinking, I don't think that Clack Mountain was this close to Lockagee, but it had been a few years since I had been, so I was thinking maybe I was just wrong. Not even a quarter of a mile down the road, it tells me to turn left onto this small one-way gravel road. Now, as soon as we turn onto this road, I'm thinking something isn't right, this ain't familiar. So I give myself enough time to find a spot to turn around. Again, this is a one-way road, so if you met someone, you'd have to either hit the ditch or reverse it all the way back out. Finally found a good spot, and I hear my friend say, do you see that? I glance up quickly and see what looks like a really large crane. It was black, and I mean like black as slate black. Its wings were so big, it looked as if it had a cape over its shoulders. It had to stand every bit of 8-9 foot tall, and although it was very bird-like, it also looked humanish. I looked back down and focused on getting turned around and getting us out of there, because I knew even if I did see whatever that was, no I didn't. My friend and I remained completely silent until we made it off of that gravel road. Once we hit the main road, it felt like the tense energy just completely left. My friend asked me what was that we just saw. I told him I didn't know, but I thought that it was best that we pretended like we never saw it and never go back. I haven't been back to Lockagee since. Let me know what y'all think about this story in the comments. If you have a creepy or scary story or unexplainable story that you want to share with me, go ahead and send it to my DMs. Or you can email it to me at allyshaysworld@gmail.com. I'm going to try to upload another video or two today. It's been so fun going through y'all's stories. Don't worry, you can remain anonymous if you want to. Love y'all. I have another scary story for y'all. This one might scare you whether it's 10 a.m. or 3 a.m. This one was sent to me by one of you guys, and for the sake of keeping her anonymous, we'll call her Dee. So one night, like 10 years ago, Dee and her friends decided to get together and catch up. They hadn't seen each other in several years at this point, and they were all on very different life paths. When they were younger, they loved exploring old abandoned houses and buildings out in the woods. So in the group chat, they deemed it was only fitting that they go explore an old abandoned building. They picked one of their old favorite places to go explore. Just to clear up any prejudgment, they they weren't under the influence of anything. So this building that they went to has had multiple uses and dates back to the 1800s. It's been a hospital with a morgue, a boarding school for children and adults with disabilities, an asylum for criminally insane people, and a residential home for the elderly. Its history runs deep. So this night they drive 3 hours to get there. By the time they get there, it's already midnight and super dark. This building sits on top of a hill surrounded by woods and a river flowing beside it. The nearest house is a farm, which is like a 45-minute drive away. They park their car on the side of the road and start walking up the path to the top of the hill. They're all giggling and nervous and running on adrenaline. They feel like the high school girls that they once were. The hole in the fence that they used to use is still there, so they climb through it and start approaching the building. It's more beaten up than what they remember, but it had been like 10 years since they'd been there. Their first stop was a water tower. They climbed the stairs to the top to scope out the area, and as far as they could see, nobody was around. They talked about all the memories they'd made there and how one of the friends had even met her husband there. They decided the morgue and the chapel were the last places that they would go because it was quicker to get back to the car from there. So they walked to the main building and they climbed through a broken window. This led to a massive hall with a serving hatch at the end of it. They always assumed it was a dining room because it was just off of the kitchen. The hall was big, empty, cold, and dark, but nothing scary or eventful happened. They explored the building, and apart from a few floors that had fallen in, it was exactly how they remembered it. Aside from one room. This room was in a separate building that had smoke damage everywhere. Walls burnt down, windows smashed, melted plastic. They remembered this is the room that one of their friends had stepped on a piece of wood and had a nail go through his foot, snapped while in his foot, and he had to have surgery to remove the nail. One of Dee's friends explained that she had a very sick feeling coming over her. She couldn't explain what it was, but she just didn't feel right. They carried on, and as they approached the part of the building that they remembered having individual rooms, which they always assumed were bedrooms, something just didn't seem right. It wasn't quite the way they remembered. All of the rooms had been burnt with the doors open. All the furniture was still left inside, but was distorted by the fire. As they walked further down the hallway, there was one room with the door closed. It had a thin window on the door, and they tried to open it, but the door was locked. Now, the last time they had been here, none of the doors were locked, and all the rooms had been fire damaged. But as they were looking through the window on this door, the room was made up. It was nice, like as if somebody was sleeping in there. I mean, the bed was made, and everything was perfectly intact. Had no fire damage like the rest of the building, but remember, this wasn't like that the last time they were there. Bit of a mental image, this room was 4 floors up. The only access to it was via stairs. The walk on the outside of the door was melted, and the door was heavily damaged by the fire. The room was stood still in time. This place was miles away from anywhere. She didn't think that this is a place that a homeless person would go. They walked around some more. Nothing else eventful happened aside from just being confused about that weird room. That was until they approached the morgue, which was a building smaller than the rest. It only had 1 floor and 1 big stained glass window. As you walk in, there's a little hallway with 2 heavy wooden arch doors that were left slightly open, just enough to squeeze through. When they walked in, the air felt thick. There was a refrigerator with some of the trolleys pulled out, which is like where they kept the bodies. Out of all the buildings in this place, this was the only one that looked like it was cleaned regularly. Unlike the other rooms, this one wasn't smashed up. There wasn't trash lining the floors, and there was only a little bit of graffiti. They looked around, stayed for about 15 minutes, and then they turned to leave. As they did that, they heard what sounded like one of the trolleys moving, and they all froze. None of them knew what to do. In that second, the entire world stood silent. He said none of them were even breathing or moving. She remembers reaching for her friend's hand and looking at her, and she just had the most petrified look on her face. They knew the only way out was the 2 heavy wooden doors, and that only one person could go through at a time. They left as fast as they could through the doors, but they made sure to hold hands the entire time. They didn't let go of each other. As they walked towards the main doors to exit, they heard what sounded like a laugh. A deep, long laugh. They ran out the main door far enough away where they wouldn't be seen, but close enough where they could still see the doors. There was nothing. No one. They decided they'd leave, go back to the car, and find a McDonald's for a coffee. But to get back to the car, they had to walk past that building. As they made their way past the building, they could hear the sound of the trolleys moving around erratically and what sounded like somebody mumbling to themselves. They walked fast but didn't run in case it brought attention to themselves. They didn't know what was in there, but they knew it wasn't a person because they had just been in there and not a soul was in there. As they get further away from the building, they stop and look back, and in that big stained glass window, they seen a bright light shining. When they were in there, the only lights that were on were their 4 lights. They watched shadows moving around behind the light for a few seconds, and then they left. As they made their way closer to the car, they heard what sounded like a woman quietly crying. They looked around but couldn't see anyone. By this time, it was like 3:45 a.m. As they walked, it seemed like they were getting closer to the crying, but nobody was around. At one point, the crying stopped. The silence was deafening. No wind, no bugs, no animals, no birds crying, nothing. They got to the gap in the fence knowing that they'd have about a 25-minute walk through the woods till they made it to their car. While they'd done this walk many times before, they had never felt like this. They had explored this place so many times and had never experienced anything, day or night. As they walked through the woods, the world came back to life. The wind, the animals, the insects, and the crying. Only now, the crying sounded like it was moving, and fast, with the sound of rustling. This was a cold winter, so the ground was frozen. The movement sounded like it had slowed to a walking pace, almost parallel. They started walking faster, and the sound of the crying and walking got faster too. They made sure that their phones were 100% charged before they got out of the car. The zero cell service. They knew they weren't too far from the car whenever all of a sudden all 4 of their phones died, which means all of their lights went out, even though they knew that they had all charged their phones. They continued walking back to the car, but it felt like it took forever. At some point, the crying and rustling stopped. They were so freaked out they couldn't really remember when it stopped. They all kept trying to turn their phones back on, but they weren't coming back on. So they finally made it back to where they had left the car, and the car wasn't there. Which makes no sense because they knew the road and they knew where they had left the car. So they walked down the road some and they still couldn't find the car, so they decided to turn around and walk back, and the car was there where they thought they had left it originally, where it just wasn't at, you know? They ran to get in the car when they noticed something that wasn't there before. A baby's car seat was left laying on the ground beside the driver's door, identical to the seat that my friend used for her 8-month-old at the time, one she had took out of the car back at her house. So identical, it had the same soft plushie toy attached to the bar. They jumped in the car and locked the doors. Right as they started the engine, they heard a woman screaming, crying, "My baby, my baby, my baby, you took my baby." And as they pulled away, there was a woman standing there on the corner watching them. Their friend who was driving sped up and didn't stop. They made it on the highway and stopped at the next gas station. They all just needed a breather, so they went in and got a coffee. At this point, it was 6:10 a.m. That 25-minute walk through the woods really took a lot longer than 25 minutes. We're all still just trying to process what just happened, when a group of people walked in handing out flyers for a missing woman and baby. The woman they had saw had a striking resemblance to the woman in this picture, but they couldn't be sure. The sun was coming up and they were all really confused, not to mention terrified and traumatized. 7 weeks later, it was still on all of their minds. They started searching social media to see if they could find any posts about this missing woman and baby. One post sent Dee down a rabbit hole. There was a lady that looked like her friend that had an 8-month-old little boy. The woman who was missing had lost her mom 3 days before giving birth and was suffering from postpartum psychosis. Her body and her baby were found 2 days after their visit at the same woods around the same building. She had taken her own life, but her baby was found living and he was fine. He was safe. He was found just past where they had seen the lady standing in the road. They've carried guilt and shame all of these years for not helping in the situation. All they know is whatever happened in the morgue is something that they still can't explain. Was it the same woman following them? Was she the person they seen on the road? Where did their car go when it went missing? How did the baby car seat just magically appear? There's a lot of questions they think that they may never have the answers to. If you listened all the way to the end of this video, drop a comment. If you have a story of your own you'd like to share, you can send it to me here or to my email at alleyshadesworld@gmail.com. Let me know what you think about this one. I've loved reading all y'all's stories. So many more to share, so stay tuned. Tell me a scary story. I'll go first. This one was sent to me by a follower who grew up in the Appalachian Mountains. Since they were raised in the area, they were familiar with the Appalachian rules, like don't whistle, don't go out into the woods alone at night, don't look into the tree line or the top of the trees. She'd never personally experienced much, but she's always been aware of the rules since her family had been experiencing things for generations. One day she was hanging out with 3 of her friends when one of the friends suggests that they go outside and take a walk in the woods. It was around 11 p.m. at this time, and the third friend was the only one that was like, no, I don't want to do this. Among the friend group, he was the only one who ever really thought cautiously and never wanted to put himself in danger under any circumstances. He begged them to stay inside because he didn't feel right about the whole going out thing. They decided to ignore him and go anyways, and they even drug him along with them. She said she can't explain how much she wished she had listened to her friend that night and just stayed home. Since it was nighttime, they all brought flashlights with them and they slowly began to walk down these trails. Nothing seemed too weird at the beginning. The night was loud, with the sounds of insects and animals roaming around everywhere. Everything was fine. They were walking and laughing and talking throughout the entire journey, until suddenly everything fell silent. No more sounds of the insects or the animals roaming around. If you know anything about the woods at all, that's never a good sign. So the friend that was leading the group stopped. Nobody said anything, and the other 3 friends were all looking at each other, unsure of what to do. The silence continued as one of the other 3 friends approached the friend in the front of the line that had stopped walking. When he makes it to him, he sees that he's just staring straight into the trees. And he puts his hand on his friend's shoulder to stop him from moving any closer. That's when they all heard this blood-curdling, inhuman scream coming from the trees in front of them. They all just stood there in utter shock. Remember the cautious friend from the beginning of the story? Well, he lost it, and he ran back to the house without warning. They had never seen him run that fast before. Which is weird because they were all aware of the Appalachian rules, so they all knew not to run. It was also just out of his character to absolutely lose it like that. So she walks forward between her two other friends to see what they're staring at, and in the trees she sees a tall, skinny gray figure standing about 7 feet tall, standing there right in front of them with its back turned to them. She couldn't comprehend what she was even seeing. She decided she wasn't sticking around, so she started to back away calmly but quickly. As she began moving, she heard her friends start moving too. They were walking back towards the house for about 20 minutes, remember, in the pitch black dark, and they hear another agonizing scream. It was more human sounding this time, though. They made it back home, unable to speak or even think about what they had just witnessed. Yep, they just brushed it off and went to sleep. Around 6 a.m., she was woken up to a loud banging on the front door. It was their friend who had taken off to the house before them. Why they weren't more worried about him not being there before, I don't know, but something just seemed off about him. Ever since that day, he never acted the same. He eventually dropped contact with them, and they've never heard from him again. Let me know what you think about this story in the comments. I want to hear y'all's stories. Stitches and duets are on. I want to be scared. Tell me all the scary stories. Or you can send them to me on here or at allyshaysworld@gmail.com. Tell me a scary Appalachian Mountain story. I'll go first. This one was sent to me by a follower who moved to the Blue Ridge Mountains, which is located in the Appalachian Mountains, when they were 12 years old. The house was around 60 years old, and her parents had done some renovations to it. They had turned the daylight basement into a master suite, so she got the original master bedroom upstairs. From the moment she moved in, she started seeing figures moving out of the corner of her eye, but whenever she'd look, nothing was ever there. She started having really weird dreams. Her closet door would open and close without any explanation in her bedroom, even though they had like that super thick shag carpet. So the doors were really hard to open and close, like you actually had to use force. Like there was no chance that these doors were opening or closing due to a draft. So one day after she had been living there for around a year, she was out exploring the woods behind the house. It was a very rural area, and I already know y'all are gonna give me hell for the way that I say rural in the comments, but I'm from Appalachia. What do you expect? So she knew there were no neighbors around, but as she was exploring in the woods, she came across this old abandoned cabin. She immediately got really bad anxiety about this and left. Well, that night, she had vivid dreams that she was walking alone in the woods again, and she came across that same cabin. But in her dream, there was a light on in the cabin window, so she went inside. The second she walked through the door in her dream, the door behind her disappeared, leaving her trapped inside, so she was trying to escape. As she's trying to find an exit, she comes across a room that is just on fire. And in this room, there's an old lady surrounded by decaying bodies. This old lady pointed at her and accused her of starting the fire. This lady told her if she caught her, she was going to unalive her. The rest of the dream, she was just running around trying to find a way out until she finally found a window to climb out of. The second she escaped, she woke up, but when she woke up, she couldn't move her body at all. But she could hear footsteps around her bed, and someone sat next to her feet on her mattress. Not to get off topic, but I've had that happen to me so many times. Please tell me I'm not alone. There's been so many nights in my life where I've felt somebody sit down at the foot of my bed when I know good and well that nobody's there. There's been other times that I've felt something crawling up my bed. I don't know. Anyway, she just kept trying to move, and she was finally able to roll over and turn the light on. But next to her bed was this dark figure. She said it looked like she was staring directly into a black hole. It swallowed all the other darkness in the room. She could see that it had red, bloodshot eyes, and it was just smiling at her. Ugh, that's so creepy. She started screaming like I think any of us would, and she woke everybody up in the house. She never saw that old lady from her dreams again, or that black figure, but she said the paranormal activity in the house ramped up after that and lasted for years. She'd feel hands grabbing her feet from under the furniture on a regular basis. Things would go missing and then reappear again in weird places. Door handles would jiggle at night. She said she had a few sleepovers, but all of her friends would refuse to come back over after a while because they all experienced things too. The day she moved out was the day that it finally stopped. This story's so creepy, especially telling it outside at almost dark in the Appalachian Mountains. Let me know what y'all think about this one in the comments. Yes, I do read the comments. I've had so much fun reading all y'all's stories, so please keep them coming. You can send them to me on here or at allyshaysworld@gmail.com. I have to tell y'all this story that someone sent me about their experience spending the night at the Devil's Tramping Grounds in North Carolina in the Appalachian Mountains. If you don't know, the Devil's Tramping Grounds has been the subject of local lore and legends for generations. If you're like me, I'd never heard of it. I looked it up. Some say that objects left in the circle before dusk will be moved outside of the circle by dawn. I also read that dogs will whimper and dig their heels into the sand if they're brought anywhere near the circle. I think I could do an entire video on just the history of this spot alone. If you want me to do that, let me know. But let's get back to the story. Living in North Carolina, he had grew up hearing about the Devil's Tramping Grounds his entire life. He's a paranormal investigator, so him and one of his team members decided they were going to go spend the night one night. He grew up spending most of his childhood in the woods, so he's very comfortable in the woods and he knows how to read the woods. He said the Devil's Tramping Grounds in the daytime feels like any other set of woods that you'll ever enter. But when the sun starts to go down, you can feel the energy change. They got there and set up their tent and got the fire started and decided it was time to go for a walk before it got completely dark. They started walking down the main trail and they came to a set of 4 trees that all had burn marks all at the same height. They were physically unable to walk through this set of trees. They tried and tried, but it felt like they were being pushed back out by something. They had to go off trail to go around these trees and they just kept going. The rest of the walk was going pretty normally, except they noticed that there were absolutely no animal sounds. Which if you know, you know. No animal sounds typically equals predator nearby. After about 2.5 hours of walking, they finally started back to their campsite to eat some supper and to set up some investigation equipment around the circle itself. They got the equipment set up and they were doing different investigation methods. After about 3 hours of that, it was around 3 a.m. He told his team member he was going to go out into the woods to grab some more firewood. He grabbed his walkie-talkie and told his team member that if anything happened, he would call him, and if anything happened to him, he should do the same. He made it about 50 yards into the woods when he started hearing very loud footsteps. He could tell it was something on 2 feet, so he kind of figured it was his team member running to catch up, so he figured he'd just stop and wait on him. When all of a sudden, he heard a loud scream coming from their campsite. His walkie-talkie went off, and his team member, who was a former Marine, was in pure panic. He called back, telling him that he was on his way, but he had just had a reconstructive foot surgery, so he wasn't moving that fast. When he got back to their camp, he noticed that their tent had been taken down in a hurry. He could tell that he just grabbed what he could as fast as possible and ran down to the cars, which were parked on the side of the road about 30 yards away from the circle. He made his way down to the cars and he asked his team member what had happened. His team member said that he was sitting with his back towards the trail that he had just walked down, and he started hearing movement and he thought it was just him at first, so he just kind of ignored it. Then there was like a big limb, like a tree branch, thrown into the camp. He knew it wasn't him then because of the size of this limb. And then he heard heavy footsteps running towards the campsite, so he jumped up, grabbed everything he could as fast as he possibly could, and ran down to the cars. They talked for a while, and he told his team member that they still needed to go back up there and get all the equipment that they had left. You know, if he didn't want to spend the night, they still needed to go get their stuff. His team member looked at him and told him he wasn't going back up there no matter what. So he told him just to go ahead and start putting what he had brought down there to the cars with him away, and he would go back to the campsite and grab everything they had left. So he walks back to the campsite, grabbing all the remaining stuff, when all of a sudden he starts getting that feeling that you feel when somebody's looking at you. Notice a rustling sound coming from the tree line on the trail that he had originally been on. He took his flashlight and was scanning the tree line when he froze. No more than 25 feet in front of him, right in the tree line, was a black mass that stood at least 7 foot tall with bright red glowing eyes. He said he stood there for what felt like forever, and it would only move a couple of feet left or a couple of feet right, which he felt like was this thing's way of telling him that he wasn't welcome. This was its property and he needed to leave. He started walking slowly backwards all the way down to the cars, but he never took his flashlight off of it and he never turned his back to whatever it was. He spent so much time in the woods and he has absolutely no explanation for what he encountered that night. Out of all the overnight investigations he's ever done, this is the one that's really stuck with him the most. This one was so creepy, I had to tell it in the daytime. Let me know what y'all think about this one in the comments, and send me all of your scary stories. You can send them on here or to allieshaysworld@gmail.com. It's ALLIECHEYSWRLD@gmail.com. Love y'all, and I'm going to try to upload a few more videos today. Imagine it's 1 a.m. and you get a knock on the door. It's the police, and they tell you they got a 911 call from a landline registered to your address. He said it was a man who called in and said that a woman and her children were hurt and they needed help. You're a single mother home alone with your 3 children. There's no man in your house. and you don't have a landline phone. I've been telling scary stories on here that you guys have sent to my email. This might be the creepiest one yet. Ugh, this one gives me cold chills. So this follower, we'll call her Sage for the sake of the story. She moved to Allen County, Kentucky in August of 2005. It was just Sage and her 3 kids. She had bought a house way out in the boonies. She had one neighbor which lived like an acre away, but the next neighbor was over a mile away. The house was surrounded by woods in the back. She worked late, so she would get home at night and she would run from her car to her door because she was so scared. She said there was always like this sense of impending dread. They would always hear noises and activity coming from the woods that didn't sound like animals. She never felt comfortable in the house either. It always felt like they were being watched. And one night at 1 a.m., she heard someone banging on her front door. She opened the door and there was a police officer standing there. They told her they had received a 911 call from a landline registered to her address. He said it was a man who called that said a woman and her children were hurt and needed help. But she had no house phone. The wires had been cut from the box to the house. There was no man in her house either. Remember, it was just Sage and her 3 kids. After they searched the house and found out nobody was there, the officer left. She went on back to bed. I don't know how you go to bed after that, but she did. But shortly after, someone or something started banging on the back door of her house. She got up to go look and see what was going on, and no one was there. And then she heard footsteps across her roof. The noises continued until dawn, but then everything went silent and she never experienced anything like that ever again. But still, she felt like there was always something watching her from the woods. Y'all, how creepy is that? She ended up moving back to Arizona the next February. Let me know what y'all think about this one in the comments. If you have a creepy or paranormal story that you want to share, send it to my email. It's linked in my bio.